When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject: The Void. User: Pretab32. Posted March 3, 1998.
Dear friends, something bad is coming. I can't tell you what, legally speaking. I shouldn't even be typing this in the first place, as I'm sure they'll find it, but I've seen it with my own two eyes, and trust me, you need to prepare yourselves. Perhaps I should start by saying that I've spent my career and the better part of my adult life engineering systems that exist at the edges of our current scientific understanding. My work has involved the types of technology that you wouldn't even begin to believe exist, much less understand, an array of what might colloquially be called theoretical devices that governments, or people even higher up, would prefer remained in the shadows. I have seen the blueprints for things that my colleagues in the private sector would laugh at as if they were fiction, but dear friends, they are not. And it was during one such project that I glimpsed the anomaly. I use the word anomaly cautiously. This is not a trivial irregularity, not some minor deviation in a line of code or a transient power spike. What I encountered was a fundamental aberration, a tearing of the very fabric of the reality that underpins all of our work, of our lives, of our reality. It appeared first as an oscillation in the field harmonics. We assumed it was a calibration issue, a slight mismatch in the resonance cascade parameters. But as we adjusted, the oscillation grew stronger. Patterns emerged, non-linear, seemingly recursive, but never quite repeating. When we plotted the data, it painted a picture that I can only describe as an unrecognizable topology, peaks and troughs, nodes and antinodes that defied conventional mathematics yet hinted at something greater. It was then that the warnings began. Messages, not from a human source either, but from the system itself. This is where I must tread carefully. You see, the systems we built, which I can only describe as simply as possible to the untrained, are complex arrays of superconductive circuits and high-capacity data cores, should not have the capability to generate this type of language. They're deterministic, at least in theory. And yet, the logs showed something else entirely. Phrases, sentences, not random strings, but coherent, if cryptic, warnings. Do not proceed. The path is broken. End of line. I cannot overstate the strangeness of this. We verified and re-verified every component. I personally disassembled and reassembled the primary control matrix, and yet the messages did not stop On the contrary, they became more frequent, more urgent, and then, God help me, I saw it. The field alignment sequence was meant to generate a stable toroidal confinement zone, a perfect loop of plasma energy that would sustain itself indefinitely. But as the sequence progressed, the field did not stabilize. Instead, it distorted, twisting into what I can only call a void. Not a black hole, not a singularity. There was no gravitational effect, no radiation, nothing that our models would predict. It was simply a blackness, a nothingness that defied all instrumentation. Lights did not reflect. Signals did not return. This wasn't even a black hole. The void was absolute. I stared into it for what felt like hours, though the system logs later indicated that only a few seconds had passed. In that moment, I understood. It was not simply a technical failure. It was not a glitch or a fault in the design. This was something deliberate. The void, the anomaly, it was a threshold. And beyond that threshold lay something that should not exist, something that did not want to be seen. What happened next, I can't fully explain. The facility went into lockdown. Automatic protocols, ones I didn't even know existed, activated without warning. Doors sealed, systems powered down, and when the lights returned, the void was gone. But the messages, they remained, now etched into every console, every display, even devices that were not connected to the mainframe. You have seen it. It knows. Do not tell. I was escorted out soon after and taken to a nearby military facility where I was debriefed, but I could tell the information they were sharing with me was meant to cover up what had happened. So, as soon as I had a chance, I fled. Yet, I cannot escape what I have seen. I cannot erase the images, the words, the implications from my mind. And the government, or whoever was in charge, knows that, forcing me now to stay in a constant state of travel. For 2 years, I have lived in hotel rooms off the beaten path, avoiding everyone and everything I can as I piece together fragments for myself, records from other projects, testimonies from colleagues who also disappeared, and yes, the faint echoes of similar phenomena that others have witnessed and dared to document, even right here. I quickly learned that I was not alone, that the anomaly had been glimpsed before, though never spoken of openly. It's always the same, a void that defies description, warnings that defy comprehension, and an overwhelming sense of something watching, waiting. Now, in the somewhat safety of this anonymous forum, I can at least hint at the truth, and I know from reading there are others out there who know something bad is coming. Stay alert, dear friends. Watch the signs, protect your knowledge, and above all, do not try to uncover what lies beyond the void. It is not something you can fight. It is not something you can understand. It is simply coming.
Subject: The Black Porch. User: Ape8cent. Posted October 1st, 1996.
Mel Caraway is the love of my life, hands down. We met on the first day of 3rd grade when we sat next to each other on the school bus, and While I won't say it was love at first sight, I somehow just knew I wanted to be her friend. She was quiet, with long blonde hair that hung over her face and clothes that looked like they'd seen a couple owners before her. My beat-up cords had obviously gone through a few owners before getting to me, and I think seeing that about each other, that helped both of us feel comfortable. Mel and I didn't talk that first day or the second, but circumstance conspired to sit us together more often than not, and by month 3, we began saying hello to each other. 6 months in, and we'd started palling around outside of school. Her parents lived over on Rockwell Line, about half a mile down from the Arco station, and I'd bike over to see her. In this part of the state, properties are divided by windbreaks made up of thick bodark trees, their gnarled trunks reaching up the sky, and I would count down the rows until her parents' property. She'd always wait for me on the porch of her house, her little legs swinging back against the wood, knocking loose chips of old black paint. Neither of us were usually quick to smile, but every time I saw her, I couldn't keep a grin from my face or a fluttering from my chest, and as the years went on, sometimes I'd blush. By that point, I knew what romantic love was and that I loved her. The day she told me she loved me too was the greatest day of my life. She was smart too and driven. I was no slouch in the brains department, but laziness was a real issue for me. She inspired me to try harder, to do better. If she'd lived long enough, I'd like to think we'd have gotten out of this town and done great things together, but I suppose it's possible she would have outgrown me and moved on. I wish she'd been given that opportunity. When we were 17, everyone was talking about this new movie you had to see, Star Wars. It's a big deal now, of course, and I read somewhere they're even going to be making another one soon, but in 1977, it was just another thing to watch together at the drive-in on Saturday night. Back then, I owned a beat-up old 63 Nova that I could just barely afford by working nights at Utotem. The night of the movie, I counted down the Bodarks, same as always, and when I pulled up the long drive, Mel was waiting for me on that black porch, dumping her heels back into the timber. Comfy old jeans were still very much a part of her look, but that night she had on a new blue and white sundress that showed off her shoulders. I wouldn't have thought that I could have fallen in love with her anymore, but I was wrong. She was radiant, perfect. At the movies, Luke whoever was up on screen shooting lasers at guys who weren't much good at shooting back, and I heard Mel curse, which wasn't unusual. I looked over at her, and in the flickering light of the screen, could see blood underneath her nose again. My handkerchief was already out of my pocket before she could ask, and she pressed it against her nose and tilted her head back. She'd had a few nosebleeds lately, something we'd blamed on the dry summer. The seizures started a few minutes later. I didn't even realize what was happening at first. She'd been talking about how mad she'd be if her new dress was stained, then stopped mid-sentence and went rigid. Her throat made this god-awful clicking sound before her arms and legs began jerking spastically, her back arching horribly. I called her name over and over, but it was like she couldn't hear me. I didn't know what to do, so I tried to hold her tight to stop her from hurting herself. The muscles under her skin were bunched like steel cable. There wasn't a thing I could do, and the movie was so loud no one around us could hear a thing. She died while the heroes up on the screen were saving the day. The doctors at Thomas Memorial said there was nothing I could have done, that something in her brain had ruptured. None of it helped, though. After it was all said and done, I dropped out of school. There didn't seem to be much to getting out into a world that didn't have her in it. After Mel's funeral, her parents picked up stakes and moved to the coast, Oregon, I heard. They didn't even bother trying to sell their house, just left it to rot. Too many memories, I guess. For me, it was the opposite. Once they were gone, I started going there after work. I'd count down the rows, same as ever, but when I pulled up into the drive, my headlights would sweep over the front of the dark house and its empty black porch. One night in the spring of 1980, I'd finished work around 11, then stopped by Tommy's for a couple beers to help me sleep. It worked a little too well, and I decided to go straight home, but when I came to the Rockwell line turnoff, I took the turn to her place instead of home. The moon was huge that night, the road almost daylight bright. Muzzy from the beer, I turned into her driveway but couldn't stop staring up at the sky. The universe was stretched out in front of me, an expanse of stars. The brakes on my Nova squealed as I ground to a stop, finally dropping my eyes to the house. There, in the glare of my headlights, dressed just as she was on the last night I saw her, was Mel. She was sitting on the porch, kicking her heels back into the wall, the same as she always had. She turned to look at me, smiled sadly, and waved. Everything tilted for a moment, the world losing all sense and order. This couldn't be real, could it? I tried not to blink in case it was enough time for her to disappear, but each time I did, she was still there. She was still there when I pushed open the car door and when I stepped out. The smile I hadn't felt in 3 years came back to my face and my chest fluttered. Foot by foot, I got closer and she was still there. The steady thump of her kicking feet was like a metronome counting off my steps. Maybe 15 feet away from her, so close I could see her chest rise and fall with her breath. I took one step further, and in an instant, she vanished as if she was never there. The fluttering in my chest turned into an ache so painful I thought my heart was tearing in half, the force of it dropping to my knees. I cried until my throat was raw, and the first rays of dawn were beginning to streak across the sky.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.